שלום, האורח שלנו היום הוא דוקטור אנטוני ג'וליוס, עורך דין וסופר. כמה מהלקוחות המפורסמים שלו הם הנסיכה דיאנה, אותה הוא ייצג בתביעת הגירושין שלה נגד צ'ארלס, ופרופסור דברה ליפשטדש, שעליה הגן דוקטור ג'וליוס בעניין התביעה של מכחיש השואה דיוויד אירווינג. דוקטור ג'וליוס כתב מאמרים משפטיים רבים ופרסם מספר ספרים, ביניהם ספר אודות האנטישמיות של טי.אס. אליוט. היום דוקטור ג'וליוס מקבל דוקטורט כבוד מאוניברסיטת חיפה כהכרה על עבודתו האקדמית, כתיבתו וההגנה על החופש האקדמי בקשר לחרם שהוכרז בשנה שעברה על אוניברסיטאות חיפה ובר אילן בבריטניה. Hello, Dr. Julius.
Hello, thank you.
It seems to me that you are a man of two passions, law and literature. How do you accommodate these two passions? Are they really compatible?
Well, I think, can I begin with some autobiography?
Sure.
When I went to university, I studied literature. It was my intention to stay on and teach literature at university. And I had a change of mind. I wanted to do something which would give me a career outside of the university, and so I decided to become a lawyer. But I always had the basic commitment to literature, and after a few years I did a part-time PhD on T.S. Eliot. So,
but what caused this change of heart?
From literature to law?
Yes.
I didn't think that I was ready to do a PhD. I wasn't sure that the degree that I would get would be good enough to stay on and do a PhD. I had a kind of crisis of conscience about literature and literary studies, and I was quite interested in law anyway. If you ask the question, how is it possible to reconcile literary studies and legal studies, I think the answer is only at the margins. And at the center of literary study and the center of legal study, those two, they will always collide. Because the one is about the normative and the other is about the transgressive.
Yet you did feel the urge to combine the two fields and do serious works in both of them.
Yes, and I would say that in order to properly appreciate the normative or the legal, one has to have a keen understanding of the transgressive, and in order to properly understand the literary or the transgressive, one has to be sensitive to the violation of norms that entails.
Would you also say, from another perspective, that the aesthetic and the ethical are intertwining or connected?
They are connected, but in my experience they more often tend to conflict. So I see the relationship between law and literature as an antagonistic relationship, and I'm drawn to the antagonism.
Right, we'll come back to that later when we talk about your work on T.S. Eliot. But before that, let us discuss briefly your career as a lawyer. Can you tell me about some interesting milestones in this career?
I'm a litigator. I specialize in court-related work.
Do you love litigating?
Yes, I do. I enjoy arguments, but I also enjoy the working through of a conflict to a resolution. There is great satisfaction in being part of that process. The work that I do in the main is for people who have private disputes, and the very last thing they want is for those disputes to be public, and we keep them confidential as best we can. But some of my cases have inevitably been fought out in the media as well as in the courts.
Yet you had one matrimonial case,
I had
famous one.
I had one matrimonial
Can
case.
Can you tell us about
where
this case?
I acted for the Princess of Wales, the late Princess of Wales, Princess Diana.
How did it come about? How did you find you?
I'm not a matrimonial lawyer. I don't like doing family law. I don't care for it at all. It's not an area of the law that interests me or appeals to me. I was acting for her in a media case. She was photographed without her knowledge or permission exercising in a gym. And,
yes, I remember that affair.
Yes,
yeah.
and the photographs were published in a London newspaper, and we sued the newspaper for breach of confidence, breach of privacy, and so on. She came originally to my firm at the introduction of another client. She worked with the firm's then senior partner, Lord Mishcon, who died a little while ago. I started working with her as well, and we developed a relationship, so that when she was told by her mother-in-law and her husband that she had to divorce, she telephoned.
She was told by them.
She was told, yes.
Advised.
I think "told" is probably the right verb. She phoned me and said, would I act for her? And I said, yes, but you understand that I don't do divorce work. It would be my first divorce case. And she said, don't worry, it's my first divorce, so we'll learn together. So,
which you did.
Which we did, yes, yes. She was a model client.
In what way?
Well, she was responsive to advice. She was very firm and resolute. She knew what it was that she wanted. She wasn't distracted by trivial considerations. She was a highly emotional person, but she was also focused. She was very impressive in many ways.
In which ways?
It required great courage and fortitude to divorce in that bright, hot light of public attention, and a lot of the press were very hostile to her, and she cared about what people thought of her, so it was difficult for her to take her own line, but she did it.
And maintained a sort of integrity?
And she maintained her integrity, yes. Yes, she did.
So representing Professor Lippstadt was more natural for you?
Yes, I mean, I am a libel lawyer. The work that I did for Deborah Lippstadt was in the mainstream of my work. I knew her book, and in fact I had read her book before I thought that we would be professionally involved. It was a different kind of case to the divorce, but in some respects there were similarities, and it was striking to me that there were those similarities. One aspect was that anti-Semitism was an issue in both cases, not just in one.
How in the Diana case?
Well, it was very curious. While I was acting for Diana, I used to get quite a lot of quite unpleasant letters from people, mainly anonymous letters, saying, "How can a Jew act for the Princess of Wales?" Yes, it was a little weird. And when
it's very surprising.
Not to me. I mean, not coming from England, I wasn't surprised.
Okay, we'll come back to that later.
We'll talk about that later, perhaps. But the day that we announced the settlement, the day after we announced the settlement, it was discussed in all the newspapers, and one of the newspapers, a leading pro-Charles, anti-Diana newspaper called the Daily Telegraph, which is the largest circulation newspaper of quality newspapers.
Yes.
On the front page, the story was, yes, Diana got a very good settlement, but what do you expect? Her lawyer was a socialist intellectual and the son of a Jewish retailer, a Jewish shop owner.
That's amazing.
Yes.
For me, I mean.
It was very interesting. Amusingly enough, Diana's lawyer, Charles's lawyer is also Jewish, but nobody knew. She's not so.
Otherwise, it would be the Battle of the Jews.
It was yes. So a lot of people telephoned me and said, "Isn't it terrible what the Telegraph has written?" And then the legal director of the Telegraph phoned me and said, "We've had a lot of complaints. What would you like us to do about it?" And I said, "I don't care. It makes the paper look bad. It doesn't make me look bad. You know, I am a kind of a Labour Party supporting intellectual, and I am the son of a Jewish retailer. None of it is untrue. You do what you want." And the next day they apologized for an unnecessary ethnic slur, but they also said, or they told me, that the journalist who had approved it, the sub-editor, was herself Jewish.
Yes, very interesting.
So.
And the other case was much more about anti-Semitism, of course.
Yes. The anti-Semitism was the most marginal aspect of the Diana case, but in the Irving case, it was at the center of the issue. Yes, absolutely. And it was Irving is a genuine anti-Semite of a very British stamp.
Right. Let's talk a bit more about anti-Semitism in regard to your T.S. Eliot book. You wrote a book which is titled T.S. Eliot, Anti-Semitism and Literary Form. The book was first published in 1995 and the second edition appeared 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. Is there a difference a significant difference between the two editions?
No, there are two differences. The first difference was that in the first edition, I made a mistake in attributing an anonymous review of a book about Nazi persecution of the Jews, published in 1936, to T.S. Eliot, along with all other Eliot scholars. I took that anonymous review, which was published in his journal, in Eliot's journal, The Criterions, had been written by Eliot himself.
Yes.
When I published the book, Eliot's widow went into the archives and found out that in fact the review was written by somebody else.
How lucky that you wrote a book.
Well, it's interesting because I had a sense that one couldn't be absolutely certain with an anonymous review. So I said in the first edition, when I was talking about the item, that I believed it was written by Eliot. But that I couldn't be sure, and that I was concerned not to do him an injustice.
Yes.
So, having said that, in the first edition, I was only happy in the second edition to correct it.
To amend it, yes.
That was the first difference. The second difference was in the second edition, I had a chance to reply to my critics. The book attracted quite a lot of attention.
Yes, it did.
And I was able to write at some length, which is not a privilege that many authors have, and point out how all the critics who were critical of me were wrong, and how all the critics who praised me were very perceptive.
Yeah, I have some questions about the book. Let us start with the aim of the book.
Yes.
In a short article I read, you wrote, I think it was in The Guardian,
yes,
if I'm not mistaken, you define your project as adversarial reading, which an expression which I find most interesting. What is adversarial reading? Isn't it in a way an oxymoron? For sure we react to a text, sometimes strongly, but not from an adversarial position, I think. Not like a litigant in a proceeding,
oh,
not as an equal adversary, but rather as an addressee, an audience. Perhaps the adversarial position denies us the pleasure of suspension of disbelief, of total immersion in the work.
No, you're right, and this is a question that I grappled with, and I imagined two kinds of reader, neither of which I was nor wanted to be. First of all, I allowed in to my model reader the possibility that that reader was Jewish. and we're talking about Eliot's anti-Semitic
Yes.
Poetry in particular, there is a very strong normative current in modern literary theory which would evacuate the model reader of all contingent qualities and characteristics, gender, religious affiliation, and so on. These are all accidents, all contingencies that the reader should suppress in him or herself in order to respond in a disinterested way to the text in this kind of Kantian sense.
Or to escape.
Yes, but to
the pleasure of reading.
Yes, yes, but to not to allow the details of his biographical personality to interfere. I took the view that it made sense, and it was closer to a proper understanding of the way in which people actually did read, to take into account certain characteristics, such as Jewish identity, particularly when it comes to the reading of anti-Semitic material. So I had two readers. I had the reader who was a Jew, who really in an act of bad faith immersed himself in the literature and exposed himself to its contempt.
Yes.
On the one hand, and on the other hand, the reader who said, I don't want to read this, I want to push the book away, I want to close the book, if I can I would ban it. And what I tried to do was to find some third position which allowed for a continued critical engagement with the work without at the same time entailing the necessary abasement before it that an uncritical immersion in it would entail.
That's very interesting. What you are really describing, I think, is another experience of reading.
Yes.
Which is different from one being immersed in a book. I mean, while you are being immersed, you don't lose the unique reaction that is entailed by your own experience, your own consciousness.
Yes, it's not. Yes, I would say an adversarial reading is not a conditional reading. An adversarial reading is consistent with total immersion, but it's an immersion which is also defensive. You submit, but you submit armored. You go into the engagement with some sense of a position to defend.
You know, I haven't thought about it before, but it reminds me of feminist reading.
Yes.
Which is described very similarly.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of the perspectives that I developed on Eliot were indebted in one way or another to the feminist feminist thinking of the 1960s and the 1970s, which were all about the experience of reading texts that in some way or another were dismissive of women and women's experience.
Yeah. Well, it might sound strange to you, but it's really a postmodernist orientation.
Yes. I mean, yes it is, and no, it doesn't sound strange. It's not, I mean, it's not how I thought about it at the time, but I can see. I mean, certainly it's to be absolutely precise about it, I would say it's post-phenomenological in the sense that it is the step beyond that total immersion in the world of the author that phenomenological criticism preaches as the proper approach to literature.
Right. Another question about the book. Is T.S. Eliot different from other great writers that were anti-Semitic, like Tolstoy, Ezra Pound, Dostoevsky, Celine, and many, many others? And maybe just another question I add to this one. And the basic entailing question, perhaps, does this fact, the fact of their being anti-Semitic, reduce or should reduce their literary greatness?
Well, actually, your two questions,
yes.
The way in which I answer the two questions is I receive it as one question.
Okay.
Because that is the difference, in my judgment, between Eliot, say, on the one hand, and Pound on the other. My view of Eliot is that he was a very unusual, of his work is that it's very unusual anti-Semitic work, because in Eliot's work, anti-Semitism is enabling. Anti-Semitic tropes, anti-Semitic language is the raw material for Eliot, out of which he makes his poetry.
He needs it in order to be creative.
He uses it. He uses
for his innovations,
yes,
poetic innovations.
Exactly.
Is that what you mean?
Exactly.
How is it possible to need this stuff in order to write poetry?
Because the poet's imagination is an amoral one. Because the poet is like a sparrow that collects his material to make his nest by using whatever material is at hand. And Eliot is the sparrow of literary anti-Semitism. He makes his poetry out of them. And what's interesting about Eliot is that the 4 or 5 poems that he wrote that were anti-Semitic, each poem has a different anti-Semitic perspective. Eliot never repeats himself in his anti-Semitism, and when he's exhausted the literary reserves, the literary potential of anti-Semitism, he doesn't write any more anti-Semitic poetry. There is an anti-Semitic period in Eliot's work, in Eliot's poetic work, between about 1917-18 and 1923-24, and if you like, that is his anti-Semitic period. Beyond that, there is no more anti-Semitic poetry, and that, in a sense, is a demonstration, I think, of the truth of what I'm saying. Now, compare and contrast Pound, for whom anti-Semitism was, so to speak, merely an extra literary obsession which polluted his poetry. So the answer to the first question, is Eliot different from the others? And the answer to the second question, does anti-Semitism degrade or diminish literary work, is the same. In Eliot's case, he was different, and his work was not diminished by anti-Semitism. And it wasn't diminished by anti-Semitism precisely because he was different to all the others. I mean, with Eliot, one's confronting the extraordinary and disturbing truth that anti-Semitism is an aspect of his greatness.
So his method was different?
Say again?
His method was different?
Yes.
Or his way of thinking about it or perceiving it was different?
Eliot approached anti-Semitism as an aesthetic challenge, and that makes him, along perhaps with Shakespeare and with Marlowe, practically unique in the canon of literary anti-Semitism.
What attracted you to Eliot in the first place? Was it the greatness of his poems, or was it this issue of anti-Semitism?
Well, anybody with an interest in English literature, growing up in England, when I was in the late 1960s, I mean, Eliot was an inescapable presence, not just the poetry, but also the literary criticism. Eliot's literary criticism is the point of origin of a whole tradition of literary analysis and literary theory. It was
the point of reference for everything
dominated.
Else, yes.
I mean, it dominated Cambridge English, which is where I did my English degree. It was the inspiration for the major English literary critics, I. Richards, William Empson, F.R. Leavis. So Eliot was an inescapable presence, and also a highly seductive one. And I was seduced.
About the other question, I want to go on a little. Is it possible to feel the same about the works after you discover or you cover this careful way of using anti-Semitic materials, or is it something that happens to us that makes it impossible to react to the work the same way?
I think with any great writer, and Eliot is unquestionably a great writer, perhaps one of the greatest, that they are inexhaustibly interesting, and one can go back and back and back and find novel arguments, novel ways of seeing the world in the work, and that is. I could imagine writing a book about Eliot that had nothing to do with his anti-Semitism.
You still can.
And yes, and might do at some stage in the future.